Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm always excited to talk about presentation skills, mainly because my entire job is speaking. I earn basically no money at all from anything that doesn't come out of my mouth. And yes, I know I got some technical books, but let me tell you, technical books are not the royal road to riches. So if you're thinking about writing a technical book, don't think that you're going to become the J.K. Rowling of technical books. It ain't going to be like that. So for the last 15 years, every significant dollar that I've earned from presenting. And it's taken me all around the world to conferences on almost every continent except Antarctica. And it's made me sit through some of the worst technical presentations of all time. Because if you're a keynote speaker, you get to stand up and speak for 45 minutes or an hour, and then you've got to sit through 3 days of other presentations. Now, sometimes that's a joy. And I have to be honest, with conferences like YOW and QCon and the other sister conferences they have, it ain't going to be that bad because they have invited speakers. And that really helps. But if you go to any other kind of conference where it's just whoever put a paper in gets to talk, what's the experience like? Well, it's kind of 50-50, I think. Sometimes you get a really great talk from someone you've never heard of before, and sometimes you've got someone you really wanted to go and see, and they give the worst talk of all time. And all of us who are technical people have to give presentations. It may not be in a conference environment, it may be just to our own group, or it may be to our customers. It's to someone. And all of us nowadays have to at some stage get up and do it, and most of us, unfortunately, don't do it well. And it's not our fault. No one ever told us how to do it well. They told us how to code, they told us how to use an editor, they told us how to use Git, didn't tell us how to talk. You're supposed to already know that, and most people don't. So that's what tonight's about. I want to share with you some ideas about when you have to get up, how you can make it a better experience for your audience, and more importantly, a better experience for yourself. How many people here don't really like getting up and speaking? How many people here are a little bit uncomfortable with it? Yeah, that's about what I usually see. How many people really love getting up and speaking? And that's about what I usually see. And everyone else is kind of in between. So let's get started. I'm going to start with the bad news. It's always good to get the bad news out of the way first. And the bad news is this talk is called Instantly Better Presentation, but if you check the dictionary, instantly is not the same as effortlessly. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to use 2 very unpleasant 4-letter words to describe what you're going to have to do in order to become a better presenter. And I've censored them a little bit, but I think you get what it is. Now, the thing about this is, many of you who are making presentations are already working pretty damn hard and not getting the rewards for it. So what I'm really wanting to talk about tonight is not just hard work, but smarter work. How you can take the same amount of time and get a much better result for it. There's also some good news, quite a bit of good news in fact. The first bit of good news is this is not just going to be me talking to you. I am very keen to take your questions. If you've come along with things you always wanted to know about how to speak better, how to present better, then I'm keen for you to have that opportunity. But rather than just sticking your hand up at any random point, I'd like you to wait to the end of each topic. So we're going to go through a topic and then I'll give you a chance. And you'll know when it's time to ask questions because the slides will look like this. So if the slide is blue, you can ask questions. If it's not blue, shut the hell up. And you have to say that because there are certain individuals in the technical communities who have no social sense whatsoever. And if you don't say that in a technical presentation, people will just stick their hand up at any time. And they won't even wait for you to call them, they'll just start talking. So, I'm very happy for you to stick your hand up at any time, but any time the slides are blue. There's even better news than this. You don't have to frantically scribble down everything I'm going to say, or more likely, just listen and then forget about it. If you go to my website, damian.conway.org, and look up ibp.pdf, instantly better presentations.pdf. This is the one thing you do have to frantically scribble down. But if you frantically scribble this down, you won't have to frantically say, yes, yes, take a picture of it. No. Then you won't have to scribble down the rest of it. And there's even better news. Possibly the best news tonight is I am not going to give you any communication theory. I am not going to go into the depths of rhetorical method or anything like that. I am just going to give you practical suggestions. Things that you can actually walk out of this room and use immediately. And I'm going to give you 7 of them. The first is going to be, you have to talk about things you know and love. The second, when you talk about those things, you have to do it in some kind of story. The third is, you are working out what to say completely wrong. I'm going to show you how to do it right. The fourth is, your slides suck. As a general first level approximation, your slides suck. And it's not you individually, it's everybody's slides suck. I'm going to teach you how to reduce the suckage. It's a technical term. I'm going to talk a little bit about managing questions and how to deal with them appropriately. I'm going to talk about showing code. How many of you have to show code or data formats or some kind of text-based information? All right? I guarantee you're doing that wrong too. So this is a great talk, isn't it? It's basically, you guys are hopeless. You do everything wrong. But the nice thing is I'm going to tell you what you should be doing instead. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about that anxiety that almost everybody feels when they're up on stage. And I'm going to give you a couple of ideas about how to be more in control of that and how to make it work for you instead of work against you. So let's get stuck into it. First piece of advice is very, very simple. Whenever you are talking in front of an audience, even on a technical subject, you must talk about something that you are passionate about. For the simple reason that most people, when they're about to get up on stage, kind of look like this. Young female and Asian. No. Young female and anxious. Just anxious. And almost all of us can relate, I think, to that feeling of standing over on the side, waiting for your turn, and just that smile that doesn't actually reach the eyes. I'm so happy to be going on next. And the high frequency vibration that makes it impossible to actually read your notes. One of the great keys to feeling confident in front of an audience is to actually be competent about what you're talking about. Have you had that experience? Having to stand up and talk about something that you weren't entirely sure that you understood completely yourself? And how does that feel? Not good. Not good at all. So, first rule is, you must only talk about subjects that you genuinely understand. When it comes to technical subjects, that almost always means that you should only talk about techniques that you are actually using or have actually used. Or if you're going to talk about experiences and what happened, you better talk about things that really happened instead of theoretical gedunken happenings that didn't actually happen. And the consequence of that is, because we don't always get to choose what we're going to talk about, the boss says, go and talk about this. But, yeah, go. You're our tech person, go. If you have to talk about it, your first job is to learn about it. To use it, to do it, to practice it. Do not be standing in front of an audience talking about something that is entirely theoretical knowledge to you that you just read in the book last week. And the reason for this is simple. If you know that you know the material, then you're going to be much more confident that you're not going to get caught out. Because that's the thing, isn't it? You're standing in front of the audience and you're just waiting for the person in the back to raise that, excuse me. And I will have that voice. I don't know why, but I will have that voice. Excuse me, that's not correct. In 1968, blah, blah, blah. And at this point, you just want the floor to open and swallow you whole, right? If you know you're not going to look stupid in front of an audience, that's a really important step to feeling confident. And you can look like this instead, which is better for the audience. The last thing the audience wants is someone who says, "Hi, I'm so glad to be here. I've got a lot to tell you." What does that do to an audience? Well, it does one of two things. The people who have any shred of sympathy in them are now feeling awkward and uncomfortable for you. And only the psychopaths are enjoying it at this point. And you don't want either of those things happening. But it turns out that standing up and talking about something you know incredibly well isn't enough by itself. If the effect of you talking about this thing that you know incredibly well is this, and you've been in that audience, you've gone to that talk that you were quite looking forward to, and the person, "Hi, I've come along to talk to you about JavaScript. JavaScript is an important language. I'm very excited to be here and I've got a lot of great things to tell." The only way you can stop your audience going to sleep is if you talk about something that you care about. Because if you care about it, that will come through in your voice, in your body language, in everything that you do. You have to have some degree of passion for the topic that you're talking about. It has to excite you in some way. Because if the internet has taught us anything at all, it's that seeing someone who's excited is exciting. So you've watched those kind of nature documentaries. You always go for low interpretation, don't you, really? You've seen those nature documentaries where you've got a group of chimpanzees sitting around in the forest clearing and they're basically banging on rocks trying to invent spaceships and things. And they're just sitting around quietly and it's a very peaceful scene until one of the chimpanzees runs out of the forest like this and is extremely excited and jumps about. Now I'm presuming that chimpanzee language isn't sophisticated enough so that sort of thing corresponds to, "I say, ladies and gentlemen, there is a leopard approaching from the southeast. I suggest we ascend to the trees to avoid this known danger." I'm assuming that chimpanzee language doesn't really mean very much at all. And yet, running onto stage, jumping about, screaming out even nonsense, is an evolutionary advantage for chimpanzees. Why? Because what do the other chimpanzees do when the one chimp comes in all excited? Do they just sit there saying, "I say, Gerald seems upset about something"? No, what do? They all get up and jump around as well. Why is that an evolutionary advantage? Because when the leopard does enter the clearing, if you're up and jumping around, you just jump a bit higher up into the tree and you're okay. The chimps that just sit around on the ground watching the show are the ones that get eaten. And the problem is, for most of us who have to give presentations, our audience will primarily be composed of primates. And that's how primates work. If they see something that is very calm and very boring and very la da 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 da, they respond in the same sort of way. If they see something that is interesting, that is energetic, that is varying in pitch and tone and voice, they respond in that way. So unless you're not speaking to primates, my recommendation is that you find some way to be energized in front of your audience, and the best way to be energized in front of your audience is to actually care about what you're talking about. So even if your boss sends you to talk about JavaScript, and frankly, JavaScript, find something that moves you about that. If necessary, just talk about how awful JavaScript is. Now, I reckon I could do that for like 10 hours. And that will inject a great deal of passion into my presentation. Because the alternative is, if you're just standing there, and now I'm talking to you about JavaScript, what's going through the mind of the audience? You know what? Even the presenter is bored by this. How can I be interested in it? People sometimes ask me, who do you think the best technical presenter in the world is? And modesty forbids me from saying the actual answer to that question. So the answer I always give them is this guy, Sir David Attenborough. And the thing that makes David Attenborough the best technical presenter in the world is not that he runs around in front of an audience and pretends to be a chimpanzee or anything like that, because he's a very calm and quiet kind of guy. But in every single picture that you ever see of him, whether he's actually doing the technical presentation, or giving a lecture, or reminiscing about something, or arguing about something, or even just showing a little girl a butterfly, you can see his absolute passion for the natural world in everything that he does, in everything that he says, even though he says it in that very calm, quiet British voice. And that's what makes him extraordinary. He really, really cares. So that's my first suggestion to you. You have to talk about things that you know and things that you love or loathe. Either way is fine. You have to find some way to be excited or frustrated or intrigued or thrilled or scared or irritated or compelled or enthralled or moved about your topic if you are going to do that for your audience. And someone's recognised the blue slide, stuck his hand up and gets the first question.
So I had to give a talk a while ago, and it was for handing over some code. It was quite boring, it didn't turn out very well. Do you have any suggestions for it?
So the question is, I had to give a talk a little while ago. We were handing over some code which was quite boring. Do you have any suggestions for that? Well, for a start, getting rid of code is the most exciting thing we ever do. It's the best day of your life. This crappy, awful code that I either created or had to maintain, someone else is doing. So naturally, there's going to be a certain energy in it anyway. But what you could do is you could find the bits that interest you about this. So you might not just talk about, here's the general structure of the code, which you have to do, I guess, but you might talk about, here are some of the real problems that we found. Here's why the structure's wrong or bad or difficult. Okay, so if you hate that code, that's okay too. That will motivate a certain level of energy in you. Anyone else want to try a question? No, too much beer and pizza. Okay, let's move on. Second suggestion, you have to tell them a story. And the reason you have to tell them a story is that intellectually speaking, no matter how smart we are, no matter how technically sophisticated we are, in evolutionary terms, we are more or less this guy. The human brain has not significantly changed in the last 100,000 years. In fact, in the last 100,000 years, the human brain has shrunk. Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons had bigger brains than we do, as is evidenced by the fact that neither of those species ever invented JavaScript. And for the last 100,000 years, we've been contending with two fundamental problems in those primitive brains. Two deficiencies. The first of them is our memory is incredibly volatile. Unless it's continually refreshed, we forget things almost instantaneously. You've got about 7 or 8 seconds. Unless you're rehearsing that phone number, it's gone. And the same is true when you're presenting information in an environment like this. If there isn't some kind of reinforcement, it's just going to go in one ear and literally out the other. The other problem with that memory is that we don't even have very much of it. You've probably heard that old saw that most people can cope with 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. Well, if you actually go into the research on this, that was an initial guess that had virtually no research backing whatsoever. Once they did the research, they discovered that the news wasn't even that good. The actual number is 4 plus or minus 1. Most people can deal with somewhere between 3 and 5 bits of information at the same time. So for 100,000 years, we as a species and as a culture have been developing tools to overcome the inherent limitations of our processing and memory capacity. And probably the oldest information processing tool that we have is the story. Before we had writing, before we even had cave painting, we had older men and women sitting around a campfire telling the stories by which the younger generation was educated, by which the accumulated knowledge of the culture was transmitted. And we still do it today. When you're a child, tucked up in bed, and your mum, or your dad, one of the servants, one of the robots, we're sitting there telling you a story. Stories have 2 characteristics that make them excellent for helping people acquire and maintain information. The first of those characteristics is called flow. A well-written story follows a reasonably logical sequence. Yeah, I know there are exceptions. I've seen Memento too. But generally speaking, they make some kind of sense. And they flow in some kind of way, and one thing happens and then something else happens as a consequence. That helps. It means we don't have to remember all the details. We can infer the details again from the remembered story structure. So that helps us to acquire the information because information comes in a reasonable and memorable sequence. And it helps us to store that information because if we remember the structure, we don't have to remember the details. And the recent research on memory indicates that we never remember the details. That all memory is basically reconstruction from stories that we have stored about events that happened. The second thing that stories do is that they have hierarchy. So a story is typically broken up into a number of separate acts. Often it's like 3 acts. And within each act, there'll be maybe 5 scenes. And the advantage of that is, if you can remember the structure of the 3 acts, and for each act, the structure of the 5 scenes, and remember those numbers 3 and 5, they're right in the sweet spot of what we can remember, then overall, you've remembered 15 things which you cannot do just flat. So stories give us a way of structuring and conveying information that works efficiently and that your audience has been taught from the time they were very young children. There are all kinds of stories you can tell in a technical presentation. You can give a historical narrative of the development of the technology. Or you can talk about the actual story of using the technology to achieve a particular task. Or you can give anecdotes of what happened when I used the technology to do this, or I attempted to use the technology to do that. And all of those are stories. So for example, if you were going to talk about web development, then you might talk about it from a historical point of view. You might start off with the precursors to the web, and then the old days when there was only HTML. How many people remember the old days when there were... yeah, that's really sad, isn't it? Okay, everything was grey with black writing. The good old days. And then you talk about, well, that turned out to be inadequate, so we had to develop presentation layers, and then you introduce CSS, and then you talk about, well, we need scripting, so we introduced JavaScript, and then web development wasn't painful enough, so we introduced Flash. And very often when you're talking about a technology, its own historical development provides a good sequence for introducing the various ideas. Because most technologies go from simple, inadequate solutions to complicated, inadequate solutions. But that works well. You start off with a simple and you get more complicated. Or you could actually do it as a process. You could say, suppose that we wanted to create a website for X. And then you just talk about, well, here's what we would do. Here are the sequence of steps that we would take. We would devise the content, then we work out the presentation, then we implement some of the animation layers, and so on and so forth. Now note you're talking about all the same topics there, but you're doing it in a different kind of story. Or you might just get up and talk about the sad experience you had developing a website for X. Here's what we thought we wanted, here's what happened when we implemented it, this is where it went wrong, here's how we redesigned it, and this is what we're going to do in the future. Any of those is a story. And what the story gives you is a logical and flowing order in which to convey the information. One of the hardest things for me sitting in all of these audiences that I sit in is the seemingly random order in which people explain technology when they get up to talk about it. If you can think of a story to tell, that's not going to happen. So a story is a tool for making complex things more comprehensible by giving them an orderly flow and a reasonable hierarchy. Making the structure in the information recognizable by the various chapters. And helping you to remember the information because you can remember the outline of it. There's one other thing that stories do incredibly well, and that is stories make audiences feel more comfortable, even if they're not recognizing a story in process. Why? Because for most people, stories are associated with times of happiness and security and safety and relaxation and entertainment. So anything that feels like a story generally feels better. So, second suggestion, tell it like it's a story, but don't necessarily tell them that you're telling them a story. You'll notice that I haven't told you, I didn't begin with, once upon a time. It's unnecessary to do that. As long as there is some storyline that you are following, the presentation will flow in a logical and reasonable sequence and be taken up better. So the slide is blue. Question?
There are times that you're discussing on a topic, but you kind of split that topic into several vertical slices that aren't necessarily bridged together. Like you might talk about something that, some technology or some architectural pattern that have a few flaws, and these flaws are not necessarily connected together. Like if you do this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. How can you tell a story in that case?
So the question is, sometimes when you're talking about a technology, one of the things you want to talk about is the problems with that technology. And very often, as we know, the problems with the technology are not a coherent set of problems. They are individual, isolated problems that occur. One of the ways you can do that, because one of the things that stories often have is they have breaks in the story. They have asides. They have, the technical term is a vinculum. It kind of connects two parts together, but it's not part of the actual story. That's a great place to put these kind of things. To put, okay, here are the problems. So I'm talking about the technology, and at the end of every coherent thing that I say about it, I say, oh, and by the way, something that's terrible about this technology is this. And then you launch into the second thing. So as long as there's an overarching story, there's room for that. The other way you can do is, it doesn't matter if there are 4 or 5 individual separate things to say, you can cluster them all together at the natural point in the story where everything goes wrong. And that's generally at the end of the second act. So you go through and you introduce the technology and you say, it's a great, da 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 da, and then you say, oh, and here are the 5 problems with it. They don't have to be related, they just have to be like a climax. And now we're left with, oh my God, there are 5 terrible problems with this, and then you better make sure that the last act of your story somehow resolves some of that. Or at least tells me how to get around them. So that's a perfectly valid story as well. It doesn't flow quite as much because it's kind of da-da-da-da-da-da, and then we're going to fire a machine gun of problems at the audience. But then we go on and we say, well, how do we recover from these grievous wounds that have been inflicted by JavaScript? Or whatever technology it is. Okay, let's keep moving. I think the single biggest mistake that people make when they're creating a presentation happens right at the very beginning. And that is the way they select what they're going to talk about doesn't produce the best possible presentation. So the very first question you face at any point when you're going to produce a presentation is, what should I say? Doesn't quite get any more general than that. What am I going to talk about? And I think as soon as you ask that question, you are in trouble. Because it's the wrong question. Don't ask that question. Never ask that question. The reason it's the wrong question, again, has to do with the abilities and disabilities of the human mind. So here's a list of things that humans aren't very good at and things that humans are good at. Just have a quick look through the list and see how you find that list. I was so tempted to swap the last two around and make it all paradoxical, but I didn't do that. So, there are things that humans are good at, there are things that humans are not so good at. I want to focus on two of those. Humans are really, really bad at recalling important stuff, just off the top of their heads. They're really good, though, at recognising important stuff if it's shown to them. And there are very different skills, and we're good at one and we're bad at the other. Let me demonstrate that to you. Who knows the story of the Seven Dwarfs? Pretty much everyone? Yeah? Okay. So, I like the George R.R. Martin version of it myself, but you know, any version of Seven Dwarfs is fine. Name the Seven Dwarfs. Don't name them out loud because then you're helping everybody else and they're not getting the value of the lesson, which is that they are crap at remembering the seven dwarf names. If getting out of this room alive depended on being able to get those, how many of us are going to make it out alive? Not many. Well, I am because I've given this talk before and I know the answer. But the rest of you, it's looking grim. On the other hand, if I had shown this slide with a whole lot of dwarf names and some extras and ring-ins, then you mightn't be able to pick all seven, but you do considerably better than you were doing when it was just off the top of your head. Are we agreed on that? Is that a reasonable agreement? And eventually, you'd probably work out that was the seven. And that's the problem. As soon as you say, what should I say, what you're really asking yourself is, what critically important things about this topic can I just dredge out of my brain with no help? And when it comes to doing that, all of us are about at this guy's level. The question that you should be asking yourself first is very close to that other question. The question you should be asking yourself first is, what could I say about this topic? No more moral imperative on it. So, if I was shown a list of everything about this topic that I know, could I pick out the important stuff? Yeah, obviously. It's a skill that we have. It's a skill that we developed on the Serengeti. Serengeti, complicated environment, but your brain is fantastically able to pick out the important stuff. So what does this mean in practice? This means that when you are going to give a technical presentation on a subject, your first job is to sit down with a piece of paper, or 20 pieces of paper, or a tablet, or a text editor, or some device, and write out every damn thing that you know about this topic. Everything that you might possibly ever want to or be able to say about this topic. And you don't worry about, is it important to say? You don't worry about, is it relevant to say? You don't worry about, is it interesting to say? You just let it stream out of you in this flow of consciousness, writing down every single thing that you know about this topic. On sheet after sheet after sheet, on screen after screen after screen. And if you can't do sheet after sheet after sheet, or screen after screen after screen, you shouldn't be talking about it. So literally, when I make a presentation, I sit down, and I'm old school, so I use a piece of paper, and I write down every single thing that I might think that I might want to say about it. And I end up with 10 or 20 or 30 sheets of paper full of information. If I don't, then I decide, maybe I shouldn't be talking about this. Or maybe I should be frantically learning about this. And then I go through and I say, well, what's important here? And I do that from the other end. It's just, that's not important, that's not important, that's not important. I basically just scrub through things until I get down to 5. Because 5 is the magic number. Upper limit of what the human brain can deal with at any one time. I find 5 topics that I'm going to talk about. And I just keep those. Those main points become the chapters of my story. And then I find a story that connects those 5. And of course what happens? I've picked out the 5 most important things, I look for a story, there is no story that connects those 5. So what do? I throw some of them back. They might be the most important, but they don't fit into a coherent narrative. So I throw 2 of them back and pick out the 2 slightly less important points that do fit the narrative. You know what? 5 not quite as important points that fit a narrative is better than 5 incredibly important points that are scattershot throughout the space. So you go back and forth with that, with your list. Of course, you don't throw away all the other points. You just leave them there and tick or cross them until you have 5 points that make a story. And then those 5 points become your chapter headings. They literally become your chapter headings. You arrange them in the order that they're supposed to be in, you make them into chapter headings, you rule lines, and then you take all of the other information that you already have written out and you classify it under one of those 5 headings or throw it out. Most of it you'll throw out. But you end up with a certain number of points to talk about under each of those 5 topics. And if you only have 1 or 2, then you think about, well, do I know enough about this? I might have to learn some more. If you have 8 or more, then you repeat the process at the next level down. You look at the 8, you say, well, which 5 of these are the most important, and make a coherent storyline. And so what you end up with is no more than 5 times 5, 25 things you're going to say, and they're already in the right order because of the stories. And then all the work's done. The rest is just mucking about with PowerPoint. Not even interesting. The hard work is done. The thing about this approach, and I use this for every presentation that I create, this approach makes the hard work less hard. This approach makes use of your strengths, which is recognizing things when you're shown them. It does take some time though. If you're going to brain dump everything you know about JavaScript, that's going to take a lot of time. Hopefully. But once you've done that, that's a resource that you can reuse. Next time you have to give a talk. So, third suggestion. They're only going to remember 5 points. So the key is you have to decide which 5 points you want them to remember, and then you have to find a narrative flow that travels through those 5 points smoothly. question?
Is it a trick, or do you have 7 points in this talk?
Is it a trick, or do I have 7 points in this talk? I do have 7 points in this talk. Why do I have 7 points in this talk? Because I'm in Queensland. When I go to Melbourne and then to Sydney, I will cut it back to 5. And I'll speak more slowly for them as well. Okay, I knew you were above average audience, so I gave you 7. Cool. I love it when someone asks that question. Okay. Next thing. You've worked out your content, you've got it all there, you've built your slide deck. What's gone wrong now? Well, the problem is that while it is critically important to get that content right, especially in a technical presentation, the really sad news is that even in a technical presentation, content is not as important as style. You think, oh God, I didn't get into information technology to be stylish. But the truth of this is, in the typical kind of presentation you're going to give, which is somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour, let's say, this is about how much content you can actually convey successfully in that time. It's a very, very small amount. And those of you who've given presentations know that this is the case. But for that amount of content, here is the amount of style you need to successfully convey it. And the visual analogy is chosen incredibly carefully here. Your content is your payload. It is the weapon that you want to explode their brains with. But in order to deliver a weapon of that size, you need a delivery system of this size and complexity and sophistication. And that's where people go wrong next. They build their little information bomb and they put it on a goat cart and attempt to deliver it through a goat cart. And the goat cart is called PowerPoint. In fact, it's an insult to goat carts to call PowerPoint a goat cart. So what the heck is style? It's not what you think it is. My favourite definition of style is this one. Style is the things that you don't see that make sure that the things that you do see are the things that you should see. I might as well say, wah, 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 for all you understood what that meant. What this means is this. Bad style is absolutely anything that you show or say or do that prevents the audience from focusing on your message. Good style focuses the audience on your message. Bad style distracts them from your message. That's all style is. Anything that helps focus your audience, that's good style. Anything that distracts them, bad style. And the single worst fault that almost all technical presenters have when it comes to setting out slides is this one. What are you doing right at this moment? Frantically reading. And it doesn't matter that I'm now interrogating you about what you're doing. You're still reading the damn thing. I'm just going to step over here and let you damn well finish it. Because there's no point in saying anything until you've read through this completely unnecessary essay on what I'm about to say. How are we doing? Done?
Good.
Good? Okay. And you know what doesn't make something like this okay? Doing this. Bullets are not the magic fairy dust that solves this problem. As soon as I put up a wall of text, I lose my connection with the audience. You're no longer focusing on what I'm saying, on my message, you are frantically reading. And the other problem is, the person who will make a slide like this will not stop there. They will make a slide like this. And alright, I had to work a little bit on that slide, but real slides look like this as well. And I swear to you, I didn't know that slide was coming up first thing. That Craig arrived and gave me his slide deck, and I just pasted it in there as well. Same problem. Far too much text. You're not listening to me. You've seen this one before. You're still reading it. Or something like this, where we have like 3 levels of bullets, and the text is not even in proper sentences, so it's hard to read. And let's throw in some clip art for some reason, and a weird logo that makes no sense. This is a real slide that someone was using. My favourite example of this was from a QCon conference a couple of years ago where I was keynoting. One of the other keynoters was one of the data managers for the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. Can you imagine how interesting that was? How many people wanted to hear about how do we manage this groundbreaking stuff? Every one of his slides looked like this. I mean, not the same slide, obviously, but the same. I've mercifully blurred out who it was. And he put this slide up and he spent 5 minutes doing this. Pointing things out with an invisible laser pointer. And then eventually had to resort to just hand pointing the thing. And the audience is, it's a disaster. But if you look at Apple, what Apple does in their presentations, their slides focus you like a razor on their message. And whether it's some kind of clever visual analogy, or whether they're just showing you the product, or whether they're just showing you this year's Apple tax. And they're still doing it after Jobs died. Now almost all of their presentations kind of look like this. They have some main point that's 1 or 2 words, and then they have like a subtext to it that's 4 or 5 words. And one of the most obvious advantages of this in this kind of large conference situation is that you can see the damn thing from the back. But the real reason they do it is not for that. It's because you can read that in 1/10 of a second and then you can listen to the Kool-Aid. But instead we get these kind of things all the time. How do you fix this? It ain't hard. Get rid of your background. I don't care if your boss says, you must use the corporate background. Put it on the first slide, put it on the last slide, get rid of it on all the rest. It's not helping. It's seriously not helping. Do not have the slide number on the slide. That's the actual slide number of this slide. You said 136 slides, but it didn't feel like it. But if you put the numbers there, now it feels like it, right? And it's kind of like this death march. Where I don't even know what the number has to get to. I won't tell you what the number has to get to because then you'd be really unhappy. So get rid of that. You don't need your name and the title of your talk on every slide. Just get rid of it. You really don't need your corporate logo on every slide. Because if you put your corporate logo on every slide, it's the only thing that's consistent from slide to slide to slide, so it draws the audience's attention, and it basically says, salesperson, 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 corporate shill, corporate shill, corporate shill. Get rid of it. If you get rid of that, you don't need the stupid bar across the bottom. And you don't need all the words. I went through this and worked out what the important words that were relevant to the message were, and it was just those ones. And as soon as you get rid of all the unimportant words, you can see how badly this information is being laid out. It's basically randomly on the page and you have to kind of hunt for it. That's not what you want to be doing. So how do you fix this? Well, when you look at this, there are actually 4 separate messages on this slide. And that is 3 too many. 1 slide, 1 message. Max. So what do we need? We need 4 slides. And when we move the things around, immediately the slides are better focused. They allow the audience to understand what's the topic of conversation at the moment, but not be distracted from the wonders of what I'm saying. We hope. So with a little bit more work, you can take even that very simple example and you turn it into this. This is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who's the guy that invented less is more. Because he was Dutch and he didn't understand it should be less is better. Every time you clutter up a slide with anything, you are overwhelming your audience. You are filling up their 5 slots and they won't be able to take in your actual message anymore. And the critical message here is, slides are not notes. I know, we like to write our slides so we can give them out afterwards as the handout. That is the wrong way of going about it. When you download damian.conway.org/ibp.pdf, you will see it's not the slides, because did you really need 277 slides? If you're doing the slides right, they will be useless after the talk. And what they need instead is some set of notes, which you would write first, and which then each point will become 1 slide on your deck. It's easy. But every time you add an unnecessary word, that's making your message harder to see. And not just words, extra fonts. There are font junkies in the room, I'm sure. Images, colours, any kind of decoration is just a distraction. So the 4th suggestion is simply this. Show less, but on more slides. Question?
Do you think there's a risk of going too minimal at all? If not simply because it maybe has that Apple look, for example, and people think, oh, you're trying to be, something about it.
It is possible to go too minimal. The more minimal you go, the more it looks like a sales presentation, if you don't do it right. And you can't, in a technical talk, always be minimal. The next thing I'm going to talk about, well, 2 things down I'm going to talk about is how do I deal with big chunks of code, which I've got to show. Now, obviously, I'm not going to say, oh, just take 3 words out of the code and show that. No. So yes, it can go too minimal, but the point is, at any one time, whatever's on the screen should be effectively the slogan of the moment. It should be short enough to fit into a brain, to be read very quickly, and not distract the audience from the extra words that you're saying.
What role should sound effects play in that presentation?
What role do sound effects play in an ideal presentation? Absolutely none. That's slides where the bullets come in like whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. I call those kind of presentations justifiable homicide. You really are allowed to kill anyone that does that. The only time you should have sound is if that sound is relevant to your message. If you're giving a talk about cantatas of the 19th century, then yes, sound would be perfectly appropriate then. Or if you're giving a talk about some technical subject and you say, if the driver makes this noise, that's a bad noise. And if you can't do it just with your voice, then you better have something that actually does it. But sound for it's music. It's no good. Don't have it. There's a question here and then a question there. No. You're too terrified now to ask the question.
What are your thoughts about slides or presentations that are just fully all pictures?
Excellent question. What are my thoughts about presentations that are almost completely done with pictures? Those kind of presentations work incredibly well if you have brilliant pictures that are completely relevant and that work as well as a couple of words. Most people are incapable of doing that. The other problem is that People who are capable of doing that often go for a very subtle picture, where the picture is only peripherally related to what they're talking about. What that does is make the audience sit there and try and work out what the picture's all about. I think that's not very helpful. So you'll notice that I don't use many pictures. I do use them when they're a better way of expressing the message that I'm trying to express, but I think they're kind of like salt. A little bit improves the flavour of the presentation greatly. Nothing but salt, not such a nice meal. Unless you happen to be incredibly talented at orchestrating that kind of thing. And I've done presentations like that, but it's a lot of work to get it to work as well. Okay, but if you have the skills, go for it. It'll distinguish you from everybody else. The other thing to say about that is, not everybody is a visual person. A lot of people are linguistic people, especially in IT technology. A lot of people are linguistically oriented rather than image oriented. And that can be a difficulty just in our field. I don't know which of the, whoever's the tougher.
You first. Especially in universities, I've seen a lot of advice, especially for foreign students, write a lot of text to make sure people understand, in case you have too thick an accent and they don't understand you.
I think if you are speaking not in your native language, that is a justification for having more text. But what I've tended to do, and I've done that in, for example, I was speaking in Japan. But what I did in Japan, I subtitled my talk. I actually had the critical points that I wanted to say as full sentences in Japanese down the bottom. And that works perfectly okay. But I would still not, even if I were not a native speaker, have a lot of text up on the... If they don't understand you, they should put their hand up and say, I didn't understand that. And you should say it again in some other way. Question behind?
You might cover this later, but what about if you've got a slide that's showing rich data? So I'm thinking of
I'll cover it later.
scientific... Okay.
What if your slide pack is more minimal and you've made those detailed notes? Do you hand them out at the beginning?
Oh, excellent question. Do you hand them out at the beginning or the end? There are two schools of thought about this. One school of thought is, I want it at the beginning so that I can annotate as I go along. The second school of thought is, if I hand out at the beginning, no one's going to pay attention to the talk because they're frantically reading the entire set of notes. Personally, I prefer to hand out at the beginning and be interesting enough that people don't do that. But they can annotate as they go along. The other thing you have to do is you have to make sure that all your surprises and your tricks and your jokes and everything that you put into it, if you put them in, aren't in the notes. But my view is hand them out at the beginning. My view is stick them up as a PDF online and people can get them whenever they want them. And that to me is the easy way nowadays. We need to move on. I kind of already talked about this one, so I'm going to just skip through it fairly quickly. Presentations aren't primarily for your benefit as the presenter. The real beneficiaries of a presentation should be the audience. And if they're not the ones that are getting the most benefit, then there's something dreadfully wrong. So if presentations are for the audience's benefit, then you've got to try and ensure that you convey to the audience the information that they need. And unless you have extraordinary psychic powers, you have no idea what information that they need. You know the basics of what they need to know to understand this, but you don't know the way that they're going to interpret what you say. You don't know the blind spots that they're going to have or the misunderstandings that they're going to have. And that means that questions are actually one of the most important parts of any technical presentation. If there's no opportunity for questions, then a large proportion of your audience is going to go away unsatisfied in some way. Now, there's always only a limited opportunity for questions, but even if they don't get to ask their question, if they see other questions being answered, they will go away happier and probably more knowledgeable. So questions are absolutely essential to make sure that the audience gets what they actually need. The problem is, from a presenter's point of view, questions are a damn nuisance. Because I've sat there and I've worked out this beautiful flow of information and these elegant turns of phrase and everything beautiful, and then someone in the middle of this wonderful rhapsodious thing that I'm saying sticks their hand up and asks something irrelevant. God damn it. And more important than just being irrelevant, it throws the rest of the audience off. Either because they think it must be relevant and now they're confused, or they know it's irrelevant and they're annoyed. You've been annoyed at that guy. Yeah? We, professional presenters call the person that does that guy. Because when you go back to the speaker room, did you hear that guy? And it's not a sexist thing, it's almost always a guy. We don't know why this is, and they almost always sit on the aisle in the second or the second last row. So you can think about that. We don't know why this is, it's just a weird thing. We don't appear to have that guy in this audience, for which I am profoundly grateful. There'll be 3 of them in Sydney. Sydney is basically the city of that guy. So the problem is, how do I provide the audience with the opportunity to get what they need by asking questions without messing up the beautiful flow and story of my presentation? The answer is simple. You do what I did at the very beginning of this talk. You have an explicit questions policy. At the very beginning of your talk, before you've said any content whatsoever, you say, look, I'm really keen to take questions, but there's a great deal to cover, there's only a limited amount of time, so could you hold your questions to the end of each topic when the slides turn blue? And that way we can integrate questions, but it doesn't destroy the flow of each chapter. And more importantly, it relaxes the audience. The audience knows when it's okay to ask a question, so you get people other than that guy who doesn't care when it's okay to ask questions, asking questions as well. And that guy is now constrained. If it ain't blue, no questions. It works very, very well. It doesn't have to be the end of each topic. You can say, look, I really do want to cover this material, so at the end of the talk I've left 5 or 10 minutes just for questions. And people will be happy with that as well. Or in a very small group environment, or if you have loads of time and very little to say, you can say, ask me questions anytime you like, and that's fine. Now, what you'll most want to do is use this one. Because you really don't want questions. You can't say that. What you have to say is this. I'm very keen to take the questions, but there's just not going to be time in the time that's been allocated. But I will be out in the corridor afterwards, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have then. And you just make sure there's an extra exit for you that leads somewhere else. Whatever you're going to do, whatever policy you're going to dictate, always be keen to do it. Always say, even if you're not keen, even if you're not going to actually answer any questions, saying I'm keen to take questions says to the audience, your opinion, your learning, your interaction with me matters. And that's a great way to set up an audience to begin with. It makes them feel part of the presentation rather than just the targets of it. So the 5th suggestion is you absolutely have to make time for questions, but you have to make the questions fit in with the timing that you want for your talk. The way you do that is by saying so in advance, and an audience is happy with that. They're actually happier with that than not knowing whether it's okay to ask a question. Question?
How are you dealing with that guy that asks questions outside of your explicit question policy?
Right.
And the follow-up question is, and when he does it a second time and then a third time?
Okay. So the problem with dealing with that guy is that the rest of the audience may not know that that guy is that guy. It may just be, they may just think, oh, that's an interesting question. And so if you say, shut the hell up and never speak again, then you'll get no more questions whatsoever. Oh my God, he just put his hand up and... That guy doesn't actually want his questions answered. What that guy wants is to be identified with you as being as knowledgeable and a peer to you in knowledge and wisdom and respect. That's all they're doing it for. They're doing it so that they can be part of the play, as it were. So what you do is you give them what they want. You take their first question. If they're asking outside the question period, you can just say, I'll just remind you when the screen's blue, you can ask your questions. And then you just ignore them. If they keep their hand up, you just ignore them. Because then the audience understands, okay, this is someone with mental problems. I'm not using you as an example, I'm just... All right, okay. And when the question comes and it's long and rambling and irrelevant and complicated, then the first time you answer it as best you can, as briefly and concisely, and trying to steer the conversation back into the way. As soon as that happens, you turn to someone else and pray there was another question waiting. If there's not, then the hand will go back up again, and the second question will be even worse. And on the second question, you say this, you say, that's a really fascinating question, but I actually think that it's at a technical level, it's a little bit above where most of the rest of the audience are. Maybe we could discuss that, just two of us, afterwards out in the corridor. And you know what? You've given them exactly what they wanted. That's all they wanted was, yes, you are at my elevated level, and we will have private and deep conversation afterwards. Just the two of us. And they will shut up. It's a miracle. They will just be quiet there. Because they don't do anything to ruin the coming glory. And then you absolutely have to make sure there's that second exit. Question down the back.
What about questions where you don't know the answer?
Oh, terrific. Excellent question. When you get a question when you don't know the answer, the only thing you can do is say something smart instead. And the only smart thing to say is, I don't know the answer to that. Because an audience, if they have nothing else, has an incredibly good bullshit detector. They will know when you're making it up. Or someone else in the audience will know when you're making it up. So what you say is, I'm not sure about the answer to that. I'd like to know the answer to that. Can we talk about it afterwards and maybe we can research a bit or I can get back to you on it. But I just don't know that. The next problem is, what happens when the next man goes up and asks a question? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. Generally speaking, I allow the first two I don't know the answers, and on the third one I say, you know what, this is clearly an area of this topic that I'm just not an expert in, so I'm not going to waste your time or mine going on with this, so I think we'll just move on. And you know what, an audience will be vastly happier with that, because the worst thing is to see someone try and make up an answer, because you can tell. You can always tell. And that makes you look very, very bad. That destroys almost all your credibility immediately. An audience will actually think your credibility goes up if you say, I don't know. And that's the right thing to do. But you've got to knock it on the head. You know, like the fifth one, I don't know the answer to that. Well, there's a kind of a bell curve where the credibility stops going up and starts plummeting. Question?
To follow on from that, what if you don't understand the question?
Ah, fantastic. What if you don't understand the question? Have you noticed that with all the questions I've been asked, I have repeated the question back, usually in a slightly different word, except when it's like 4 words long and there's no other way to say it. That's part of the trick. If you ask a question, you need to repeat it, because the only person in the room that everyone can consistently hear is you. Because the people at the front of the room, their ears are getting in the way. Especially if they're part of the British royal family, it'll be impossible for them to hear. And people at the back can't hear a question from the front because the voice is going in a direction. So it's your job to repeat the question, and if you paraphrase it, then they will say, no, that wasn't the question I asked at all. Or if you just can't make any sense of the question at all, you have to say, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that, could you rephrase it? And when they rephrase it and it's no clearer than that, then possibly someone around them will say, I think that he or she is asking about this or that. Or ultimately, you just have to say, I'm sorry, I'm just not understanding the question. Can we talk about it afterwards? there is a great power in deferring things to afterwards. Because you don't want to lose the flow. You don't want the audience to kind of get kicked out of the flow state that you try and get them into. Okay. Promised I'd talk about code. And again, most descriptions of code that I see don't seem to work for me. I see a lot of code thrown up on screens and I don't understand a lot of it. Now, I'm a pretty smart guy. I've written books about programming and I can't follow what's going on the screen. And I'm willing to bet that most of you have had that experience. I think the reason for it is the way that most people show code is not helpful. So whether it's code or it's some kind of declarative structure or it's a data format or something, what you typically get is something like this. I'm going to throw the thing up on the screen and then I'm going to laser point at points of it and talk about it for a couple of minutes. I'm going to say this is a grammar and this is a way of specifying the behavior of a parser, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter what it's about. There's enough on the screen here that I'm going to have to stop and talk about each of these components and what they are for about 3 to 5 minutes. And then I'll say, and when you have a grammar like this, it builds a syntax tree like this. And now what am I going to do? I'm going to point at various bits of it and try and explain how it relates to the previous thing, which is no longer on the screen and which most of your audience has now forgotten the details of. And then I'll say, and then to go from this, we execute a piece of code, and the code looks like this, and the code is Perl code, so no one understands it. So we spend 5 or 10 minutes just going through the code, trying to explain what it is. And you say, and when you execute that code, you get a data structure like this. And that's what you see all the time. You see it all the time in technical presentations, and it's a disastrous way, except for maybe 1% of the audience who have no lives, but eidetic memories. And for the rest of us, it's just hopeless. The problem is that when you have 4 very complicated text-based slides that have been explained over 10 or 15 minutes, as soon as you move to the second slide, everything from the first slide gets forgotten. And there's no way of correlating what's going on. So when I'm doing that particular explanation of parser technology in Perl, which I really do teach from a particular class, remember I said talk about things you actually know and experiences you've actually had? Well, this is what I actually do. I start off saying, we want to see whether this represents a sentence. And how do we do that? Parsing technology does that by saying, if it's a sentence, then the sentence can be broken down into these components, a subject, a verb, an object, and some kind of modifier. And they in turn break down into smaller components, and they break down into multiple components, and eventually you break it on down. And of course I wouldn't talk this quickly about it, I'd go through and explain what each of these were, but here you don't care, you're just seeing the technique. And once you get down to a one-to-one relationship, then you've classified everything. And then the question is, well, how did I work out that that was the structure of the graph? And the answer is, that's what a grammar tells us. A grammar is a static way of declaring that kind of structure. So we say a sentence consists of these things, a clause consists of these things, a compound verb consists of this or that. And now you're seeing the relationship between those two things. And then we go back to the actual graph and say, okay, well that's great, but how do I get a data structure out of this? I get a data structure out of it by reversing all the arrows. And then I use each of the things being pointed to as a label for each of the things from which the arrow leaves. And I literally just join them together, label, value, label, value, label, value. And then I recursively do the same thing at the next level up. So if you look at the compound verbs, then the same thing happens. And again, and again, and ultimately all the way up to that data structure that we show. And again, I would do it more slowly, explaining each step along the way, but do you see what I'm doing here? I'm allowing the audience to follow the transformations and the relationships between components by animating them. Now, did that take some time to get the animation right in PowerPoint? Damn straight it did. But the benefit of it is I can spend less time in the presentation and get much more understanding across to the audience by doing it that way, and that makes it worth doing. Same thing if you're doing some kind of code work through. So this is the actual code that does that step of consolidating things with their labels. And I would actually explain it by saying, well, we start off in this code block, and we can see it's a code block because it's got this incredibly ugly code block delimiters around it. And then we localize it. I don't care if you know what localization is in Perl. You know, there are only 4 people on the planet that know what localization is in Perl. I think only one of them is in the room. So let's not worry about it. But we localize the stack, and then we push onto the end of the stack an extra stack frame. And then we match our sub-rule going down the tree, and then capture that information, and then we do another block. In the other block, we relocalize the stack, and of course, if I'm actually explaining this to Perl people, I explain why we localize the stack, not that you care. And then we pop the stack, and what is being popped off the stack? That thing that we just pushed onto the stack, but now it's filled with all kinds of glorious data as well. And we put that back into the next level up the stack under the name of the rule that produced that stack frame. Right, now even if you don't understand what's going on there, did you notice how you knew exactly where to look and exactly what I was talking about all the time? And at no stage did I have to do this. Okay? Do not use laser pointers. Because laser pointers are always used like, I don't know why you have to do that, but you have to move them around all the time. And it's just distracting. Laser pointers take an audience of primates and turn them into felines. You might as well do this. Now, when I'm explaining that putting it into the stack under the same name, I would go back to the animation and say, and that's literally doing that. And then go back to the code and keep describing it. If I'm refactoring some code, I can animate that as well. So I want to take this local time function out and make it more powerful. So I literally say, I'm going to take the local time function out. I'm going to put it into some subroutine. I'm going to add some more stuff to the subroutine. And then I'm going to call the subroutine in its place. I'm willing to bet that's the clearest example of refactoring you have ever seen. And it literally took me 30 seconds to produce it. Because that's not fancy animation. That's literally just 8 slides in a row where I change one thing on each slide. But at every point, the thing that's standing out is the thing that I'm talking about. So it holds your focus. Style is the things that you don't notice that make the things that you do see the things you should see. When I'm transforming code, I talk a lot about how to do functional programming to people who only know how to do procedural programming. And when I'm trying to explain that to them, I say, you don't have to leave your beloved Perl. I work with Perl people on the streets. And go to Haskell or something like that. You can do functional programming in Perl. So I say, here's a typical kind of procedural code. We create a variable, we go through a for loop, selecting out certain elements and populating that variable. We sort those elements into a very complicated sequence. We make another variable, and we go through another for loop, pulling out the things in the appropriate sequence. So it doesn't matter the details of this. This is actually from a real class that I teach as well, by the way. What matters is, okay, that's typical procedural programming. Variables, for loops, etc. So how do I show them how to do it in functional programming? Well, the first thing I don't do is then say, oh, and here's another completely different slide with the functional version. Because that doesn't help you understand how they're the same. So what I do instead is I say, procedural code has a whole lot of what we call infrastructure in it. And these are the parts of the code that are only there because the language is so stupid. If the language was smarter, we wouldn't need them. So we can get rid of them, rearrange the remaining components, put a very small amount of functional infrastructure in instead, and we get exactly the same thing. And what do I do now? I go through it again. But of course now I go through it backwards. take the elements out of the data structure, select the ones you're interested in, sort them, pull out the information you actually want, and put it in the variable. And for the first time someone says, oh, that's all there is to functional programming, I'm not scared anymore. But I did that in a way that allowed them to see the relationship between what they knew and what they didn't know. And that's a little bit of effort, but much less than you'd expect. The only slide that required some kind of complicated animation was the one where it whirlpooled around. Everything else was just done very, very simply. So you don't have to have complicated animations. You can just do cell animation. Literally, that's what I do whenever I'm going through a piece of code. I make one copy of the code all yellow, and then I copy it like 50 times, and then I go through with a white highlighter tool and just highlight what I'm going to talk about next. You know the other advantage to doing it this way? I never muck up the description or the explanation. Because whatever goes wide is what I talk about next. So I can orchestrate the right way of explaining this, even if I don't go line to line to line, but jump around, and I always get it right. This really is a much better way of showing code, and it works just as well for XML, or it works just as well for file formats, or for anything else that's a lot of text. It also works for things like graphs, or charts, or tables. You do exactly the same sort of thing. Use a different colour, a different intensity to highlight what you're supposed to talk about next, or to highlight relationships between things. So, for code simulations, for refactorings, for walkthroughs, for transformations, on code, on I/O, on file formats, on any kind of text, animate. I have questions, but I've only got about 5 minutes to go. So I'm going to defer you to the corridor. Actually, I'll defer you to come up afterwards. I apologise, but we've had so many good questions that I've wanted to let them go. I mean, we outnumber Craig quite considerably, so we could probably hold the room as long as we need to. But I think I should just move on at this point. The questions are important, I'm sure, and I want to answer them, but we are supposed to finish shortly. Last topic. I want you to be able to get up in front of an audience, and if not delivering your message fearlessly, at least less fearfully. Because that's the worst four-letter word, isn't it? Fear. And the thing is, fear doesn't look like that, it doesn't feel like that. Fear feels like this. And once again, it's evolution messing around with your emotions. So let's consider a typical presentation scenario, and here is one. So you've got the audience all sitting together and facing in one direction, and you've got the speaker at some distance removed facing the opposite direction. And this is the problem. You look at this just as a chimpanzee scenario. Which chimp don't you want to be? The one standing by him or herself while everyone else is staring? Yeah, you want to be in the group. But of course, when you're speaking, you're not in the group. You're isolated, you're the only person in the room facing this direction. Everyone else is facing the other direction. This is not the chimp you want to be. Because when you're this chimp, what completely fills your field of vision is this. Other primates staring at you. This is not a naturally comfortable position for a primate, even for a human primate. This is not something we experience very often, unless we're completely delusional about our own attractiveness. Oh yes, I'm used to people staring at me all the time. And there's only one thing worse than being in a room with a whole lot of people focusing their attention on you, and that's when they do this. What are you doing now? Humans have managed to convert that threat display into smiling and laughter. So if you're doing this job well, if the audience is enjoying themselves, you're going to feel worse. Because they're baring their teeth at you. Stop doing it. Just settle down. Now, the good news here is that you can actually fight back against these evolutionary urges. You can actually harness and make use of that nervous energy. But you have to do that not here, but here. When you're getting ready for something that you really are not looking forward to, like standing up and speaking in front of an audience, and when you're getting ready for doing something that you really are looking forward to, going out on the first date with the love of your life, the actual sensations are almost completely identical. It's just the severe activation of the nervous and the parasympathetic nervous systems, predominantly in your stomach, because that's where all the nerves are. But the way you interpret that depends on the concept. You know, you're going out for that big first date, you're going to be feeling good about it. You're going to talk in front of, you know, some big audience that you're not happy about, you're going to feel bad about it. But it's all up here. It's all the label that you put on the sensation. So if you reconsider the way that you classify and label these sensations, which you will continue to have, that will change how you feel about speaking. So when you're having that sensation, if you label it as fear, guess what? It's fear. But if you label it as energy, then you can say, I'm energized. If you call it anxiety, you'll be anxious. If you call it excitement, hopefully you'll be excited. Now, it takes a conscious effort to do that, to feel that and say, I reject the interpretation that this is fear or anxiety or worry or stress, and I substitute this other positive word instead. I guarantee you, the very first time that you get up to do this and you do that, absolutely nothing will happen. It will make no appreciable difference whatsoever. You will still feel fearful and anxious and nervous. But if you keep doing it, then you will start to rewire your automatic association between the sensation and what it means. And eventually you get to the point where you long for that. And when you don't have that feeling, you're thinking, uh-oh, something is horribly wrong here. The other, even more practical way of decreasing your anxiety is to actually rehearse. I have this very strong rule that I never give a presentation for the first time. And I am aware of the logical difficulty of that. But what I mean is I never give it to a meaningful and important audience the first time. If you see me speaking any presentation, I will have given it live at least 3 times beforehand. And by live, I mean I will have been standing up, I will have done it out loud, I will have done it in the actual time that is available, and I will have done it to some kind of audience. Maybe I'll rope in some colleagues over lunch and say, look, I've got to give this talk for our company, you guys have got to sit there and listen to the talk first. Or if you're in a relationship and you're getting a bit tired of your significant other and you're not sure how to end it, you can ask them to listen over and over and over again to you rehearsing your talk. Or if you have a cat. Cats are sensational practice audiences because almost any cat after the first couple of seconds will be doing this. If you can hold the cat's attention, human beings will be no difficulty whatsoever. Don't use your dog though. That just does not help you. The real trick here is use the internet. No, don't broadcast it on Facebook or something like that. I'm saying the internet has hundreds or thousands of pictures of audiences. And you can just go and find one that best approximates the kind of audience you're expecting to have. You know, I'm going to Sydney later this week, so it'll be something like this. Actually, they're all in black, so that's Melbourne. Throw it up on a big monitor and talk to it. Because what that's going to do is give you the experience of talking out loud to a whole lot of primates that are staring at you. And they're staring at you with a really fixed stare. You can cope with that, you can cope with a real audience doing that as well. But you have to pick your audience picture carefully. You don't want one that's kind of too aggressive, because that's really only like one step away from. So, the fear that you feel is a natural evolutionary response to a genuinely uncomfortable and unfamiliar situation. So the way you fix it is by relabeling what that interpretation is of that, of changing your response to that condition, and of becoming more used to the actual experience. By talking more, by practicing more, by having some kind of even synthetic audience in front of you. So to sum up, how can you instantly present better? Well, everything that I've said tonight is all about communication. It's about knowing the topic that you're communicating very, very well so you feel comfortable with it. It's about caring about that so you feel energized by it. It's about structuring your communication into some kind of story which allows you to communicate more effectively. It's about having visuals that actually enhance the communication rather than distracting from it. It's about scheduling the questions that you take so that it doesn't interfere with the communication process and in fact improves it. And it's about rewiring yourself so that you communicate confidently, which relaxes the audience and makes them enjoy the experience more. And if you do any one of those 7 things, or better still, all 7 of those 7 things, then I promise you, your presentations will indeed instantly become better. So thank you very, very much. We're done.